University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He worked as a French-English translator in the Ivory Coast in the early 1980s and taught English literature at the University of Ivory Coast. His career in journalism began as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post and many other publications in West Africa. He was hired by the New York Times in 1986 and worked as a metropolitan reporter for 3 years. From 90 to 2008, he reported for the Times as bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West Africa, Japan, and the Koreas, and China in Shanghai. During this time, his work was twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He was twice the recipient of an Overseas Press Club Award, and he also won the Grantham Environmental Award, among many others. He was also named Doctor Honoris Causa by the University of Maryland from 2005 to 2008. Alongside his work for the Times, Mr. French was a weekly columnist on global affairs for the International Herald Tribune. He is the author of A Continent for the Taking, The Tragedy and Hope of Africa, written in 2004, which was named Nonfiction Book of the Year by several newspapers and won the 2005 American Library Association Black Caucus Award for Nonfiction, and was runner-up for the Ulysses Award in the Art of Reportage and for the Hurston Wright Foundation's Nonfiction Prize. Other awards include an honorary doctorate from the University of Maryland. He's also the author of China's Second Continent, How 1 Million Migrants Are Building a New Empire in Africa, which was published by Alfred Knopf in 2014. His work has been published in The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, Transition, the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Crisis. He is also a documentary photographer whose work, Disappearing Shanghai, Images and Poems of an Intimate Way of Life, was published in 2012. French was a 2011 Fellow of the Open Society Foundations and is presently researching a book about the geopolitics of East Asia. So welcome to our speaker.
We can hear you perfectly. I'm going to flip the laptop so it looks like you're actually speaking to a crowd of people instead of me.
So you would like me to go on until what time?
About like 50 minutes, and then we can leave the rest for Q&A.
So 6 p.m. roughly Q&A?
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, so just one second, I'm just going to flip you over.
Sort of see the ceiling.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry to put you through that lengthy introduction, and I'm glad there's a little time left. I'm going to, this is a bit strange for me. I've never been great at estimating the length of a particular talk, and I very often, as I did yesterday, do a lot of sort of ad-lib type lecturing. But I've actually written out a bunch of notes for this, and I have no idea how long what I've written will take me. There's a tremendous amount to say. I'm going to try to cover a great deal of ground quickly and hopefully inspire you to sort of pick up on several leads and to pursue them as your own interests would dictate. But I don't know how far I'll get in the allotted time because I don't know how to measure these things terribly well. So it's a once over quickly type presentation, but really rich in information I hope you'll find. But I might even, if time doesn't permit, I might have to sort of put on the gas pedal and accelerate further and save certain topics perhaps for the Q&A period. The time challenge is heightened additionally because I'm really going to try to start here in a second at the beginning, as it were. Where did Africa come from as a concept? Where did the name Africa come from? Why do we call Africa Africa? But before I get into that, I want to raise a thought with you that I hope permeates everything that we discussed today. I was asked to give this lecture because, in part, there is a prevailing sense of gloom and negativism and pessimism that often hovers over the topic of Africa. And so when Veronica asked me to give the talk, one of the things I think that interested her in having me speak to was that I had written a book with the word hope in the subtitle. And so I think she had harbored the interest that I could speak a little bit to hope. And this is where I'd actually like to begin before I even start on history. Begin with the premise, which I hope to challenge you with, that whatever negative notions you have of Africa, of African development, of Africa's place in the world, of African progress, of African wealth or development or economics, I put it to you that Africa has turned out much better. The Africa that we're familiar with, the 54 independent states that we see familiarly on the world map, that this Africa has turned out far better than perhaps one had any right to expect, given the experience that I'm about to describe to you, which did not condition it or prepare it in any way for a positive outcome at all. So where did Africa come from? Africa, meaning the name Africa. Africa is, the name Africa has its origins in the Roman Empire. Rome colonized parts of northern Africa, and there was an ebb and flow of Roman Empire in Africa over a period of centuries. But early in the Roman imperial era in Africa, the Romans came into contact with a group in the country that we presently identify as Tunisia, and this group, ethnic group, had as its name the Afri. I'm going to talk a little bit later, much later in this talk, about what tribe means, and tribe is a highly charged and problematic term. It's used very loosely and without any, almost always, without any sense of its history, etymology, or social history. But the Romans, so for the purposes of the name Africa, the Romans, the Afri, were a Tunisian quote-unquote tribe. And because Rome had a colony there, and because Rome didn't at that time have, Europeans had no genuine sense of the extent of Africa as a continent, Africa becomes a derivation of the name for that tribe, the Afri. And so Africa comes to take its name from a small people that's actually forgotten today. It doesn't even exist anymore as a separate group today in Tunisia, which is a country sort of northwestern corner of Africa. The Roman imperial interest, Roman colonization of Africa, as I said, had ebbs and flows, came to include high water mark in the early Christian era, all of North Africa, almost all. North Africa became, in this period, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. The Romans extracted many things from their African colonies, but probably the most important thing was a supply in grain. Wheat and other grains were grown in North Africa and used to feed the city of Rome and the Roman army. And at the height of this exploitation of North African grain, Egypt was alone. Egypt was a colony, exporting or supplying between 100,000 and 200,000 tons of cereals every year. And the rest of North Africa, meaning what we identify today as, say, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya, were supplying another 200,000 to 300,000 tons of wheat and other grains to Rome. So Africa, I like to start talks about history with this little economic fact, because Africa, although in current discourse we think of Africa as being a place of misery and tragedy and violence and failed development, etc., in fact, Africa, from a longer historical perspective, has always been a source of incredible wealth, as seen by the outside world. Typically, a source of wealth to be taken over, or a source of wealth to be plundered. There's another thing before I move on that has to be said about the name Africa, this word Africa. In this era, and prior to this era, meaning the Roman era, if one were able to travel from Europe deeper into Africa, beyond North Africa, across the Sahara Desert, into the Sub-Saharan regions of Africa. There was no notion among African peoples, the peoples who inhabited this geographic space that we now call Africa. There was no notion among these peoples that they have something in common called being African. Africanness is an entirely modern concept. The notion of being African comes from the experience of slavery, which begins early in the 15th century, first from the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were sailing down the coast and beginning to engage in the slave trade, and subsequently discover, quote-unquote, the New World and begin this triangular trade involving slaves taken to the United States and to Brazil and to the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera. Subsequent to that, and we're going to talk a lot about what happened subsequent to that in a minute, but subsequent to that initial connection of worlds, which culminates in colonialism, a notion among Africans begins to spread via their contact with and exploitation by Europeans that there's something called being African. We're all African. Of course, Africans all knew they were from a particular region, the people in a particular region shared linguistic characteristics and may have shared other physical characteristics, but the broad notion of an African identity is, again, I'd like to underline, a very recent thing in the scheme of things. So I'd like to move toward population. Population is an incredibly important feature of African development across history that one has to understand in order to get a sense of whether or not Africa has done poorly, whether or not Africa has done better than one might have expected, as I have suggested, or how Africa has fared in the past and may fare in the future. We all know, or we should all know, that humankind originated in Africa. The modern human-like populations emerged in Africa about 5 million years ago. And the population of Africa in that era, in the early ages of this emergence of this new species, is really confined to some rather constrained little nuggets of Africa. In the Great Rift Valley, which runs from the Ethiopian coast on the Red Sea down through Kenya and into Tanzania and Malawi. It's the Kenyan and Tanzanian and Ethiopian portions of this long valley, which I incidentally happened to have visited last summer, which were the cradle of mankind, and where our species emerged as an animal species. This happens 5 million years ago. It wasn't until about 100,000 years ago that the continent of Africa attained a population of 1 million people. I don't know if you all have a sense of the size of the population of Africa. I'm sorry, the continent of Africa. But the Mercator projection map that you're most familiar with, the map that you see that has North America looking really, really large, and very often Mercator projection maps have North America prominently featured front and center of the map. Those maps are distorted. Any map that aims to depict the entire Earth is a distortion, because you can't make a round thing flat without distorting it. But those maps are tremendously distorted of the size of Africa. Africa is vastly larger than it appears on the most common kinds of maps that you will have all grown up seeing. It was from the emergence of our species, it took until 100,000 years ago before the population of this vast space reaches 1 million people. I'm going to get into a bit why that's the case and what's the relevance for present day, which is quite real and quite significant in a moment. But before I do so, I want to say, the point I'm trying to make here is that human population growth in Africa has, until the most recent moment in time, in other words, in the last few years, been an incredibly slow and incremental thing. Human populations have grown very slowly in Africa, historically speaking. Population has always been the major challenge of Africa as a continent. Human populations begin to explode after mankind leaves Africa and begins to migrate to other parts of the world. The first place that this happens is in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley in present-day Syria and Iraq. Well, that's actually not entirely true. It happens a bit in Africa in the Nile River valley, which is one of the first great civilizations in the world. But globally speaking, the population of mankind really begins to explode after people begin leaving Africa. And there's an important reason for it. Africa is struggling this whole time. From 5 million years ago, the emergence of the species, to 100,000 years ago, to the point where Africa gets for the first time 1 million people, to about 30,000 years ago, when modern human beings, Africans, if you will, had essentially colonized every part of the African continent. It wasn't until 30,000 years ago that happened, starting from the Rift Valley I spoke of. And the reason for this fragility of and slow growth of the African population, generally speaking, across time, has been that since mankind originates in Africa, then the diseases of mankind also originate in Africa. That the endemic diseases that affect mankind are almost all have their origins in Africa. All of the important ones have their origins in Africa. The great endemic disease. And so mankind had to, there are other factors involving climate and the emergence of intensive agriculture, and particularly well-adapted environments outside of Africa that lead to the explosion of populations in various other places. But this presence of endemic disease in the African environment is an incredibly important historic factor in terms of suppressing African population across the ages. So mankind had to actually leave Africa to get away from the environments that favored the propagations of these diseases. I'm turning a page here, but so 30,000 years ago, we get to the point where there are Africans all over Africa. Pretty much the entire continent has been colonized, if you will. I'm speaking here, not as I will speak later of colonization by Europeans, but colonized by humans. In other words, inhabited by humans who have begun to adapt to every different environment that they encounter across the continent. The other thing that has made population growth, historically speaking, slow and fragile in Africa has been a variety of environmental factors. Africa has 2 of the world's largest deserts, so you have this incredibly large continent. But it has an enormous amount of space that is given over to the Sahara Desert, and immediately adjacent to the Sahara Desert, a zone called the Sahel, just to the south of the Sahara Desert. And these are immense spaces themselves, neither of which, the Sahara doesn't allow for human habitation, and the Sahel, especially in its northern reaches, except in the river valley of the Niger River, which is one of the world's great rivers, outside of that river valley, the Sahel, this other great zone, doesn't have a climate or soils that favor agriculture. And so right away, just by desert and arid climate, you have a huge piece of Africa that doesn't favor agriculture. In the southern part of Africa, you have the Kalahari Desert, which spreads across the countries that are presently known as Namibia and Botswana, and would rank as a great desert in the world all by themselves if we hadn't stopped first to talk about the Sahara. Second to this now, you have the world's second largest rainforest. You have a rainforest basin centered in the country that we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is second only to the Amazon rainforest basin, and which is sort of centered around Congo River. And I have had experiences as a reporter, as a journalist in my career, flying over this incredible space. And you can go literally for a couple of hours, depending on the trajectory, and never see the ground. You will never see the earth. All you see is treetops. And the treetops are brought together so densely that from 20, 30,000 feet, as you might be in a jet airline, it looks as if it were heads of rocket down below, bunched the whole way across for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Places like that have incredibly dense foliage in the rainforest allow for human habitation, unlike the Sahara, but they don't allow for dense human habitation. it's difficult to establish a toehold in that kind of environment. It's difficult to farm in that kind of environment. And so you add these things up, and the agriculturally viable parts of Africa become relatively small compared to the overall size of the continent. So endemic disease first, then environment and geography second, have been historically immense challenges to Africa in terms of building up a head of steam in terms of the demographics of the continent, building up the population. If you don't build up a population, you don't achieve a certain kind of population density, then there are a number of important things that you can't do in terms of either economic or political development. You don't develop cities, because cities demand not just a dense population in the city, but cities demand a certain population density in the ambient surrounding hinterland. And if African populations are small relative to the size of the continent and dispersed, then you have great difficulty developing important cities. If you don't develop important cities, then the thing that flows out of the cities in history, the city-state and the state itself, become difficult to form. And so this demographic challenge is of immense political significance to Africa.
Wow, still? Did you made a password? Everything? Can you create a password?
The password usually didn't work because I had like this long, it's kind of character you're not allowed to use it.
You're stuck here.
I'm just going to
Superficial.
bad food. I'm not playing it any longer. So. Oh,
You just. Oh my god. Where did you go? It doesn't work. Yeah, dude. He just stands right in front of the camera. He's like, I can't see it. Why is it so nice clothes?
No, it's not. You can't like that. What is this, dude? 5 prisons? No. A nice fun. It is though. You see? This country.
Country. Jesus.
Would you rather?
Give me 5 seconds.
Violence and foreign social issues, what do you say?
What's the bug? Stay connected, yeah. Fortune. Or superfood, like. With African children. Just here for a second. Yeah.